The alien girl moved through the bustling human colony, confident in her species' natural camouflage. Her kind had evolved to bend light around themselves, making them effectively invisible. She smirked, watching the oblivious humans pass by, unaware of her presence. But then she felt it, a gaze. Her heart pounded as she turned. A human man stood there, eyes locked onto her. Impossible. No one should be able to see her. Yet his expression shifted from confusion to something else, realization. She followed his gaze downward and gasped. Her camouflage worked on clothes too. Panic surged through her veins as she bolted, her invisibility flickering with her distress. The human grinned, taking a slow step forward. "I see you," he murmured. Her face burned. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just seen. She was exposed. And worst of all, he knew her secret. She ducked into a narrow alley, pressing herself against the cold metal wall, willing her body to disappear completely. Her heart hammered. How? How could a human see through her camouflage? No species had ever detected her kind before. Footsteps approached. Slow. Deliberate. "I know you're there." The human's voice came again, amused but not unkind. "You can keep running, but I'll still see you." She clenched her jaw. This wasn't possible. Maybe he had some kind of enhanced vision? Cybernetic implants? Or was he just different? Swallowing her panic, she activated her cloaking field again, forcing her skin to blend perfectly with the surroundings. A few seconds passed. Silence. Maybe he'd given up? Then, warm breath near her ear. "You're not as hidden as you think," he whispered. She yelped, whirling around. And there he was, watching her, smirking. "What are you?" she demanded. His smirk widened. "I could ask you the same thing." She glared, her skin shimmering as she tried to recalibrate her camouflage. It wasn't working properly, flickering at the edges. He could still see her. This human was dangerous. She took a cautious step back. "How can you see me?" He crossed his arms, tilting his head. "Good question. Maybe I'm just special." Her frustration flared. That wasn't an answer. Her species had studied humans extensively. None of them should have the ability to see through cloaking. Unless... Her eyes narrowed. "Your kind is primitive. No technology advanced enough to break my field. So how?" His gaze flicked over her, and she stiffened. "I think," he said slowly, "it's not about technology." She swallowed hard. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Maybe you're only invisible to people who aren't looking for you." Her breath caught. That didn't make sense. Cloaking wasn't about perception. It was science, biology, physics. It bent light, tricked sensors. It wasn't something a simple human could just see through. "You're lying," she hissed. The human chuckled. "Am I?" His eyes gleamed with something she couldn't decipher. Curiosity? Amusement? A challenge? She clenched her fists. She needed to get away. Report this anomaly. If a single human could detect her, others might, too. Her species relied on secrecy. If that was compromised... "You're panicking," he observed. "Don't." She bared her teeth. "You don't understand what this means. I understand that you don't want to be seen." His voice softened, surprising her. "But I do see you." A strange shiver ran through her. No one had ever said that to her before. She shook her head. Forget this ever happened, but his smirk said he wouldn't. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "What's your name?" She hesitated. Giving a human her name was a risk, but he had already seen too much. Lying wouldn't help. "Silent," she admitted, barely above a whisper. He grinned. "Silent. I'm Kai." She exhaled sharply. "I don't care." Kai chuckled. "Oh, but you do. Otherwise, you be gone already." Her jaw tightened. He wasn't wrong. Something about him unsettled her. More than just his impossible sight. It was his interest. Humans weren't supposed to see her. They weren't supposed to look for her, and yet here he was, not just seeing her, but studying her. "I don't have time for this," she muttered, turning sharply. "Will I see you again?" he called after her. She paused for half a second too long. His grin widened. "You will, won't you?" Silent forced herself to keep walking, her skin finally stabilizing into full invisibility. But even as she melted into the shadows, she felt his gaze lingering, like he could still see her. It sent an unfamiliar chill down her spine. Impossible. He was just a human. A strange, frustrating human, but still just a human. And yet, she had been trained to observe, to slip through worlds unnoticed. But for the first time in her life, someone had noticed. It rattled her more than she cared to admit. Silent clenched her fists, forcing her mind back to logic. She needed answers. If Kai could see her, were there others like him? Was this a fluke, or something far more dangerous? She had to find out. But as she disappeared into the city, one thought nagged at her. Why did part of her want to be seen again? Silent kept to the shadows, but her mind refused to quiet. Kai wasn't just some anomaly, he was a problem. If one human could see her, others might, too. She needed to report this, but she didn't. Instead, she found herself retracing her steps, watching him from a distance. He leaned casually against a railing, arms crossed, as if he knew she was still there. "I can feel you watching," he murmured. Her breath hitched. This was a mistake. She turned to leave. "Come back tomorrow," he called softly. "You want to—" Silent didn't answer, but she did. The next day, she told herself she was only observing, gathering data, nothing more. Yet, there she was. Kai sat in the same spot, arms resting lazily behind his head, a smug grin tugging at his lips. "I knew you'd come back." Silent's camouflage wavered. "Annoying human. You don't know anything." He tilted his head. "I know you're curious. And I know you're tired of being invisible." Her chest tightened. He wasn't wrong. Still, she scoffed. "You talk too much." Kai smirked. "And you hide too much." For once, Silent didn't have a response. She exhaled slowly, trying to ignore the way his words unsettled her. No one had ever spoken to her like this, like she was more than just a shadow. "I have nothing to say to you," she muttered. Kai leaned forward. "Then why are you still here?" Silent clenched her jaw. She should leave, should erase this moment before it became something dangerous. But instead, she let her camouflage drop just for a second. Kai's expression softened. "See? That wasn't so hard," she scoffed. "You're insufferable." His grin widened. "And yet, you keep coming back, and somehow, she knew he was right." Silent hated how easily he got under her skin. She had spent her life unseen, untouchable. Yet this human unraveled her with nothing but words. "I should kill you," she muttered. Kai didn't even flinch. "But you won't." She narrowed her eyes. "How can you be so sure?" He shrugged. "Because if you wanted me dead, you wouldn't keep showing up." Silence stretched between them. He wasn't wrong, and that scared her more than anything. Finally, she turned away. "This is the last time." Kai just smiled. "We'll see." And deep down, Silent knew this wasn't over. Silent tried to stay away. She really did. But no matter how far she went, her thoughts kept circling back to one thing, one person. Kai. His words lingered, needling at her carefully built walls. "You're tired of being invisible." He had said it so casually, like it was obvious, like he knew her better than she knew herself. It was infuriating, and worse, it was true. 3 days passed before she found herself back in the same place, watching him from the shadows. He sat on the railing, legs swinging lazily, as if he had been waiting. "Thought you were done with me," he said without turning. Her breath caught. "How did you—" "I just knew." He glanced over, eyes bright with amusement. "You're predictable." She scowled. I am not. Kai smirked. Silent, you're standing in the exact same spot as last time. Heat flared in her cheeks. She should leave, walk away, vanish forever. But she didn't. Instead, she let out a slow breath and stepped forward, fully visible. Kai's grin softened. Hey there. She hesitated, then, against every instinct, sat down beside him. For the first time, she wasn't just a shadow. For the first time, she let herself be seen. And Kai? He just smiled, like he had been waiting for this all along. Silent had spent her whole life unseen, a ghost in a world that wasn't hers. But now, sitting beside this human who defied all logic, she felt something strange, asterisk real star. Kai didn't ask questions. He didn't demand answers. He just looked at her like she was meant to be seen. Maybe, for the first time, she glanced at him. This doesn't mean I trust you. Kai chuckled. Of course not. But you'll be back. She should deny it. She should leave. Instead, she smirked. Maybe. And for once, she didn't disappear.